Hi, Rama. It's week 20, day 3 of our Bible narrative reading plan, and today we are in 2 Samuel chapter 3 and 4. We've seen that Saul has died, David has become king over Judah, but he has not immediately become king over the entire nation of Israel. This is going to be a difficult journey to the throne, even as it has already been difficult. We saw at the end of 2 Samuel chapter 2 some important names mentioned, Joab and Abner, and we saw that there was bloodshed and there's battle and there's feuds and there's all these things that are taking place. And it continues here in chapter 3. We see that Abner, remember, was Saul's uncle. He was the general over Saul's army in some respects, and so he has been seeking to continue Saul's legacy, but now here in chapter 3 he seems to be uniting forces with David. We see in chapter 3 verse 1 that there's a long war between the house of Saul and the house of David. This lasts at least a couple of years, at least 2 years, somewhere between 2 to 5, maybe even 7 years. We're not told exactly, but it continues for a while. But notice that it says, and David grew stronger and stronger, while the house of Saul became weaker and weaker. And in this process, Abner no longer seems to be fighting for Saul's house. He joins up with David. Where we see here verses 2 through 5, the mention of David's sons at this time, his children. Some of those don't seem to grow to adulthood because they're not mentioned until later on. But the story continues letting us know about this growing of David's strength and the weakening of Saul's household, of Saul's kingdom. And so we see that Abner has changed his tune. He's not trying to continue in Saul's name, and he's seeking to join up with David's kingdom. And so he's speaking to the elders of Israel. He's working this sort of thing out. But then we see that Joab, who is David's nephew, murders Abner. And once again, we see that this feud that happened in chapter 2, this battle that took place, is now coming back into play in chapter 3. This is why Joab goes and murders Abner, even though Abner seems to have been working for David in the sense of uniting these two kingdoms. But Joab is personally seeking revenge. And so the text is very clear, the narrator of the book is very clear that David did not authorize this. David had nothing to do with this. David is guiltless in this incident, so much so that David curses his own nephew Joab. He says, you shouldn't have done this, and he puts on an elaborate funeral for Abner, the most in-depth description of a funeral that we have in the Old Testament. David mourns the loss of Abner. David does not rejoice in the death of enemies. He doesn't rejoice in the death of those who were once enemies, who are now seeking to be a part of his kingdom. David is not rejoicing in evil. But the evil continues. Here in chapter 4, we see that Ishbosheth, who is Saul's son, the remaining son of Saul, and he's king over the rest of Israel, he is murdered in his sleep by two thugs. And these thugs come to David with Ishbosheth's head, and they think that this is going to bring them blessings. And David said, look, guys, have you not heard when Saul died, I did not rejoice in that, and I punished the man who came to me saying that he had something to do with that. Here you guys have very clearly taken the life of Ishbosheth. How do you think that you unrighteous men are going to succeed before me, killing someone who is righteous like Ishbosheth? And notice this is the other guy. This is the other king. This is the one who's keeping David from reigning over all of Israel, and yet David is seeking reconciliation. David is being a godly, righteous man, a godly and righteous king in this instance. And he doesn't welcome this news from these two thugs, and in fact, he has them punished. He has them executed. And so David is not seeking the kingdom in any wrong way. He's had plenty of opportunities to kill Saul, and he said, I'm not going to do that. And now he's not killing Saul's offspring. He's not killing his political enemies. He's letting the Lord fight his battles for him. And so we come to the beginning of chapter 5, the first 4 verses, and we see that David now becomes king over all of Israel. After the death of the other king, Ishbosheth, the people come to David at Hebron, and they say, it's time for you to be our king. Even during the days of Saul, you shepherded us, you fought for us, we want you to be our king. And so he is publicly anointed. All the elders of Israel come to the king at Hebron. They make a covenant with him. They anoint David king over all of Israel. He's 30 years old at this point as he's finally able to begin reigning over all of Israel. So we see that God has kept his promises. God has brought David to the throne, even in unlikely ways, even as he's used human sinfulness. He's used what the actions of these humans, of Joab and Abner and all the people in the story. God has used that to keep his promises. God is working to bring his king to the throne. Here's a summary of today's reading. For more information, go to tunemyheart.org.